This week, the Supreme Court unveiled a ruling right before Shabbat overturning the federal abortion protections guaranteed in Roe v. Wade. To talk about the Jewish perspective on abortion, why abortion is essential to healthcare, and what rabbis do after this ruling, here's a conversation with Rabbi Hara Person. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. As of the release of this podcast, it's day 121 of Russia's war in Ukraine. If you want to donate to help Ukraine, there's a link in the podcast notes with resources to do that. Okay, let's dig into the main focus of this episode. Rabbi Hara Person is the chief executive of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, or the CCAR, which is the Reform Movement's rabbinical association. And her story, in many ways, spans the arc of abortion access in the United States. Rabbi Person's great-grandmother had 2 abortions as a poor immigrant at the turn of the 20th century in New York City. When the rabbi was a child, Roe v. Wade, the landmark Supreme Court ruling, came down and said there was a constitutional right to have an abortion. So she spent most of her life living with that right. As an adult, she has continued advocating for and protesting around lack of abortion access because she knew that federal abortion protections were not guaranteed to stick around forever. And she was right. Republican presidents who lost the popular vote, most notably and recently the insurrectionist Donald Trump, successfully got a conservative majority on the Supreme Court. And now we've got the ruling in the case of Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization about a Mississippi law that bans most abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. The issue at play was that the law violates the precedent set by Roe v. Wade, which said that states can't ban abortion until 24 weeks of pregnancy. And it's pretty astonishing, not surprising, but still sort of mind-numbing to see the result. The Supreme Court decided 6-3 with a conservative majority after almost 50 years of Roe v. Wade and the right to abortion to just say, psych, none for you. There's a slight caveat to that, which is one of the conservative justices, Chief Justice John Roberts, upheld the Mississippi law, but thought that overturning Roe v. Wade was going too far for the scope of this case. So technically, the Supreme Court overruled the right to abortion 5-4. But it's not like that technicality really helps anyone. It's projected that now 26 states will ban abortion in most or all situations now that Roe v. Wade is gone. There's a lot to say about what abortion access will look like in this country and how we got to a Supreme Court where justices can lie under oath about respecting the precedent of Roe v. Wade and then overturn it anyway. But for this episode, I want to get right to the conversation with Rabbi Person, because the big question now is, what comes next? And for the majority of Jews who support the right to abortion, it's time to strap in for the long fight to get that federal abortion protection back. That'll mean understanding where we as a people and a faith stand on abortion and articulating clearly why abortion access is a matter of fundamental health care. And it'll mean seeing clearly that if we're going to get this country back on track, we're going to have to wrestle it away from fundamentalist, extremist, right-wing Christians. If you want a broad overview of how the Jewish world is responding to the ruling, let alone the world at large, and a good explainer of the ruling itself, links to all that will be in the podcast notes. For Minnesota Jews, there's also a piece by Jen Parker, Jewfolk Inc.'s community engagement manager, about how to start fighting back. Wherever you are, if you have abortion clinics or abortion funds nearby, think about donating to them. And if you're worried about your digital footprint being tracked in relation to abortion restrictions, there are a couple of links in the podcast notes to resources to help you manage that as well. This conversation with Rabbi Person has been edited for length and clarity. Keep in mind that it was recorded 2 weeks ago before the official Supreme Court ruling came out, so mentally translate from any theoretical points brought up to the fact that this is all reality now. So, what is the Jewish position on abortion, and why does it matter that it's usually different from what people consider to be sort of the religious view on abortion in America?
The Jewish view on abortion is very different than what people generally think of when they think of the religious view on abortion. I think in this country, the faith perspective on abortion, on reproductive rights in general, is not actually the faith perspective or the religious perspective. It's a religious perspective. It's really the perspective of the Christian right. And the Jewish perspective, and by the way, other religious groups as well, other sort of faith perspectives are very different than that. So first of all, Judaism doesn't believe that life starts at conception. Judaism believes that life really starts when a baby emerges from the mother. So like you could say when it crowns, some say when it takes its first breath. Until then, it's only potential life, which is to say that if you have to make a decision about whose life you're going to save, you save the mother's life because the mother is already a life. The mother's already a person, a living being in the world. And the fetus is only a potential life. So that's a huge difference between the Jewish perspective and other religious perspectives. And it goes far back in our text. This is not a contemporary view. You see echoes of this really as far back as Torah, but certainly in our codes, in Talmud and so on. And it makes for a very different perspective on how you manage rights, reproductive rights, abortion access, when you prioritize the life of the person who's pregnant over the potential life of the developing fetus.
And to make the urgency around the conversation on abortion sort of clear, I want to ask you why abortion matters, but I want to do so by asking you about the story of your great-grandmother, which you brought up sort of several times when you're speaking and when you're writing. You've written that she had 2 abortions. So what was her story, and how has her story affected you and your family?
Yeah, it's had my great-grandmother's story has had a huge impact. My great-grandmother, whose name was Lena, I think it's important to say her name. She was in many ways a sort of classic figure. Like we know the story, or we think we know the story, immigrant from like the Poland, Austria area, came here as a 16-year-old on her own, ran away from an arranged marriage that she didn't want any part of. I mean, a brave, bold woman, but a poor immigrant also. And, came to the Lower East Side of New York, like so many Jewish immigrants did, got married, had 4 children. They lived in, what today we would call tenements on the Lower East Side, very small apartment with 4 children and a husband, and could not afford to feed anyone. I mean, she could barely afford to feed them. My grandmother, her daughter, talks about like their lunch would be a slice of pumpernickel bread and a pickle. Like that's not a lot of food to feed 4 growing children, but that's what they would get. So money was really, really tight. She took in piecework. She had a Singer sewing machine, which I have her sewing machine today. She cleaned home. She did everything she could do to bring in income. Her husband was not a great provider financially. He also wound up dying young, but that's another story. So she had all these people to feed, and she could not feed any more children. And so she resorted to having 2 abortions with knitting needles. The way I know this story, I know it 2 ways. One is that my grandmother was basically a witness. These apartments on the Lower East Side were really small. There was no privacy. My grandmother, who was the only girl, slept in what was also the kitchen. So at night she would sort of take out a bedroll and that's where she would sleep. The brothers had the bedroom and the parents slept in the front living room, so to speak, living room, dining room. So my grandmother was displaced. She was told, like, you can't sleep here tonight. You have to go sleep over there. And she saw what was going on and she heard. I'm sure it probably was noisy and messy. I mean, I don't know. So she knew as a child what was going on. And both she and my great-grandmother herself, who I knew, made sure that my mother knew this story, that my sister and I knew this story. And my great-grandmother was actually alive when Roe v. Wade happened. She had always been a follower of Margaret Sanger, who I understand, today has been somewhat discredited, but also did really groundbreaking work. And my great-grandmother believed in birth control, and she believed in giving poor women the ability to manage their lives and their futures and their children's. So she and my grandmother both made sure that I knew this story and that I knew how important it was, not just partly for women and the ability for women to get out of poverty and to get educated, but also for the family structure as a whole and for the community as a whole, that when you have access to birth control, when you have access to abortion, you have the ability to make better choices and to better sort of care for your family than you would otherwise. And in many ways, my sister and I are the recipients of that, even down several generations, because you can see that with the ability to make decisions about reproduction, you can also make decisions about more options like education and, moving out of poverty. So there's no way to not kind of connect some of the privileges I've had in my life to the fact that my great-grandmother took matters into her own hands and made these choices for herself, and therefore, did what she could to protect the 4 children she already had.
I kind of have to ask, given all of that, what is it like? I assume Roe v. Wade passed sort of, you say your great-grandmother was around, but also I assume you were young at the time. What is it like kind of now as an adult and a mother seeing what is likely the end of that federal abortion protection? Because that's kind of a strange arc to be alive for.
My sister and I were both reflecting on this. We went to our first abortion march, I guess it was in March, in 1989. So my sister was a college student. I was in grad school at the time. And the two of us with some friends took off and we went to Washington, D.C. because even in 1989, we felt embattled. And we felt that rights that we had grown up with were in danger. And it's nuts. That's 1989. I was young. And I went again in 1992. I went to a march, exactly, the same thing for abortion rights and reproductive rights. And at that time I was pregnant. And I remember thinking I'm lucky. I wanted to be pregnant. I want this pregnancy. I'm excited about this pregnancy, but I'm lucky. How many other people, because we also know today it's not just women who are pregnant. How many people are pregnant and don't want to be pregnant, and how horrible that is to bring a child into the world that you don't want, that you don't know, even if you do want, that you don't know if you can care for the way you want to care for it. It might not be, a time in your life that you really can take care of this child. I mean, there are so many reasons that people have abortions, right? We talk about rape and incest. That's a terrible situation to bring a child into the world under that kind of a cloud. And then the thing that right now I will just say is making me crazy is lawmakers who don't understand the reproductive system, the female body, medicine in general, and who are making proclamations that actually, when you take apart what they're really saying is, we have no regard for women. We have no regard for people who have who have a uterus, basically. We don't care about them. Because if you look at some of these things like this whole thing that's emerged right now about ectopic pregnancies, you can't have an abortion in the case of an ectopic pregnancy. First of all, it's not an abortion. When you have an ectopic pregnancy, it's a life-saving medical procedure for the pregnant person. It's not an abortion. That is not a viable fetus. And, the fact that lawmakers are standing in the halls of, government and making proclamations about in the case of an ectopic pregnancy, we still have to save the fetus. No, there's no life to be saved there, right? There is no way that is a viable life. And if you force the pregnant person to continue that pregnancy, they are going to die. That boggles the mind, because that's really saying we don't care about women. We don't care about people who can get pregnant. They can die. Who cares? I mean, that's just mind-boggling to me. That's way worse than what we were even dealing with in 1989 or 1992. I mean, it's mind-blowing. It's misogyny. That's a terrible place for us to be as a country.
And just for listeners, an ectopic pregnancy, for, I guess, mostly guys who may not know, is when the embryo attaches itself outside of the uterus, and it can be it's not a viable sort of pregnancy, and it's extremely dangerous for the mother. And that's kind of the situation you see. I think it's just so many federal and state lawmakers, for some reason, saying that shouldn't be allowed. It's bizarre.
Yeah, I mean, because what it means is that a woman shows up because you don't necessarily know you have an ectopic pregnancy. You're testing positive on pregnancy tests, and you may really want this baby, but suddenly you're in extreme pain. Maybe you have an infection already. You have a fever. You show up at a hospital, and now the hospital is going to refuse to help you because it's going to be seen as an abortion instead of like a life-saving procedure for the person who's pregnant. What the hell? I mean, and that's happening, by the way, with other kinds of situations as well, because, look, the reality is a certain percentage of pregnancies, and I'm not a doctor, but a certain percentage of pregnancies are not viable pregnancies. So, to have a spontaneous miscarriage is a pretty common occurrence. And a lot of women just miscarry at home and move on, or not move on. I mean, not necessarily emotionally move on, but, they're fine physically. But a certain significant percentage of miscarriages don't get completed and you have to have a follow-up medical procedure because, again, the woman is going to risk sepsis and infection and may lose the ability to get pregnant again. And they show up at a hospital. If they show up at a Catholic hospital, they're not going to get the healthcare they need. They show up at a hospital today in one of these states, that has like Oklahoma or, these laws, they may not get the healthcare they need. And we're seeing these stories. They're happening all over the country. And it's terrifying because, again, it's like saying to a live person, like, your life doesn't matter. And this person maybe has other kids. This person has a spouse. This person has a job. This person has a place in their community. And we're basically saying, not we, but, lawmakers are basically saying these lives are disposable. The thing we care about is this mass of cells, which is not even a viable mass of, so like this is never going to grow into a person. But no, we're going to prioritize that over this person who now has a high fever and an infection.
In case it wasn't obvious to listeners how this sort of isn't just a philosophical or some morality play. This is a real healthcare issue that has actual implications for people's actual ability to live their lives in terms of health. So to get to kind of the elephant in the room, I guess, the Supreme Court ruling that we're expecting pretty much any day now. And I have to put a disclaimer in that, at this point, literally any day now. So by the time this podcast comes out in 2 weeks, like, we might have already seen the ruling. But at the moment, it has not come out. But, we're all expecting it'll come down and gut federal abortion protections and take down Roe v. Wade. So the question I want to ask you is what comes next? It'd be great to hear from you what your outlook is, especially as, the chief executive of the Central Conference of American Rabbis.
So, I think it's going to be a really sad day in America because this issue, there's the specific issue here, which we've just been talking about now. But there's a bigger issue, which is the issue of separation of church and state in this country and the issue of religious liberty. And, those are two founding principles of this country. Those are things that make us proud to be Americans. And what happens in the wake of the overturning of Roe is that religious freedom is now going to be stripped from a significant percentage of our population. And that is both those who have other religious beliefs like we do as Jews, like we will not be able to practice our faith. We will have, we will be prohibited from practicing what we believe from a faith perspective about our bodies, our families, our lives. That's huge for Americans. That's a terrible thing to do and a very scary thing to do. And also there are people who don't have a faith perspective who are, and that's part of who we are as Americans too, like not having a religious belief. And all of this is about the imposition of the religious belief of some on the many. And that is a huge problem. That is not who we are supposed to be as Americans. So I think that the implications are huge and scary. And, a lot of us who are in these conversations are very worried about what other personal rights are now going to be endangered because, you take away one, it's easy to take away more. And that's a pretty scary place to be as Americans. So that's kind of one piece. And then there's another piece, which is, we kind of go back to some of the tactics that my predecessors were doing in the 60s. I mean, I was a child, but, I wasn't doing this, but there were a lot of rabbis who were part of kind of underground networks helping people get abortions. And, those passageways to abortion are already being set up. People are doing work on, how we do transportation, how we fund this, how we deal with the legal issues around. Because, part of what's happening in some of these states is not just that it's illegal to get an abortion, it's illegal to help somebody get an abortion. And I hope that those laws are going to be challenged because, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I think that there are a lot of legal complications around some of those laws. And, I'm making this up, but, so look at the laws in Texas. If you help somebody in Texas get to California to get an abortion, well, you're doing everything legally as far as California is concerned, but you're breaking the law as far as Texas is concerned. So I think there are questions of jurisdiction and I know New York State is setting things up right now to help the people who help people get abortions. But again, how does that play out then in Texas or in Oklahoma or wherever? So, I think there are a lot of questions that this is going to raise. But practically speaking, rabbis are going to continue to advocate for reproductive rights. They're going to help people get abortions. They're going to be involved in raising money for these different abortion funds that are already in existence. I think we'll be doing a lot of speaking out, a lot of activism around this. And we're not going to go quietly and saying oh, okay, the law changed. Oh, okay. This is going to have to be, I imagine this will be something I speak about and my colleagues speak about for the rest of our lives. It's very troubling to move backwards. And I don't know if I've even seen that in my lifetime. Maybe if, we had a lot of time to think back, maybe there would be other examples, but this feels like a huge, huge rollback of rights. Because it's not just about abortion, right? It encompasses so many other things. And that is terrifying. What that means for us as Americans in this moment is terrifying. The fact that the religious right has control over our personal decisions, the personal decisions that we should be making, with our healthcare provider, with our family, with our God. Excuse me, who are you to tell me what my relationship to my body should be? So, and we're going to see it. I believe we're going to see it in way more ways than just around abortion. So I think there's going to be a lot of work for faith leaders to do and for the rabbis I work with to do, and there's a pastoral piece too. There are going to be a lot of pastoral conversations that come out of this. What do I do when? How do I cope with the emotional upheaval of this? How do I deal with the family issues? People are going to be having babies who really in other circumstances wouldn't be having them. So what do we do about that? How do we help? There's going to be a lot to do.
So actually on the note, you sort of brought this up several times of in some sense, this is about abortion, but it's also about sort of a lot of other rights alongside abortion. I actually want to ask you kind of a complex and long question related to that, but one that I feel is important to ask. When hearing from Jews on abortion, it seems like the number one line is about religious freedom, that taking away federal abortion protections violates Jewish religious liberty. But I'm worried that in some sense, by talking about that, we're actually missing the core mechanic at play here, that Roe v. Wade and the right to abortion is based in a right to privacy under the 14th Amendment, not a First Amendment argument about religious liberty. And that detail really does matter because the Fourth Amendment right to privacy is the legal basis for gay marriage and the right to access birth control. And by not focusing on that, I'm concerned that American Jews are, in some sense, undereducated about the bigger picture of what's going on here and how exactly all these other rights are at risk if Roe v. Wade is dismantled. So it seems like we don't need more First Amendment focus. We need more legal defense of the 14th Amendment. So I wanted to ask your thoughts about that because it's almost kind of conflicting between how we as Jews want to talk about abortion rights, but also how maybe we should be talking about it, given that the actual mechanics of this really matter to understand if we're going to sort of ever make a change in the future about how this is going down?
Yeah, well, you're talking to a rabbi. So, I mean, thank God we do have a lot of lawyers who are looking at the 14th Amendment piece of this. But I think that privacy and religious liberty in many ways go hand in hand, because part of privacy is, it's not just what you do in your home behind closed doors, it's what you do in your house of worship as well. How do you adhere to the tenets of your faith? That is also part of privacy. So I think it's hard to kind of completely separate those issues out. And like I said, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm always going to come at this from the perspective of separation of church and state and religious liberty. That's the language that I speak. But, I do think that they're so intertwined, because how do you have privacy if you're being told you can't follow what your faith tells you to do, or your lack of faith tells you to do, right? I mean, the imposition of one group's religious beliefs on the country as a whole is not just, it is a religious liberty issue, but it is also a privacy issue.
So the last question that I've got for you is, it'd be great to hear your perspective on the CCAR vote 100 years ago that technically allowed women to become reform rabbis, even though no woman was ordained until 50 years after that vote. What can we maybe learn from how long that process took about how to strap in and prepare ourselves for long fights like the one abortion will unfortunately likely soon be having?
Yeah, it's so interesting to look back in our history and see that indeed in 1922, the Reform Rabbinate voted to admit women and that women could become rabbis. Now, there's an important piece of that history, which is, you might picture a group of male rabbis sitting around a room and having this conversation. But actually, what really influenced the conversation was the wives of the rabbis. And there were some very strong-willed, very outspoken wives who, in another age would have been rabbis themselves. And they really pushed the issue and really, I think, are the ones who made the vote happen the way it happened. Now, part of the challenge is systems. And that's a challenge here too with this issue. In some ways it's reflected in your previous question about the 14th Amendment. Things aren't just based on what we want or what we believe is right, but also on the systems that enable us to carry out certain kinds of decisions or live in certain ways. So, the CCAR is the body that is the professional association of reform rabbis. And we have been since 1889 when we were founded. What we are not is the ordaining body. So, it was one thing for the CCAR to make that decision in 1922. It's another thing for the ordaining body, which is HUC, Hebrew Union College, to actually go through its process and make its decision about who should be ordained. And there were women who, it's a whole other conversation we could have in another time, but there are fascinating stories of women who pushed the boundaries and got sort of close to ordination, but never got ordained between 1922 to 1972. There were some daring and brave women who really tried to make a go at it and didn't succeed. There was not institutional support at HUC. There were both faculty and board members who were really opposed to it. So in many ways, the CCAR had this vote in 1922, which was brave and bold and, meaningful. And yet it didn't have the teeth or the, sort of the power to actually make that happen until HUC decided that it was going to make it happen. And then, and part of the story is about Rabbi Sally Priesand, who, she tells the story this great way. So HUC used to have an undergraduate part, like you would enter as an undergraduate in Cincinnati, and which is what she did. And other women had done it too. And then they would get, like a degree in Jewish education or something like that. And the way she tells the story is like she was there as an undergrad and she just kind of stayed. And at a certain point, somebody turned around and said, "Oh, she's still here," which is, I love that. Like, she's still here. And, and she just was incredibly persistent, and she was able to get people to support her, in the administration and ultimately on the board. And she got ordained. She was the one who kind of broke through, and she was ordained in 1972. So, the thing is, like, history can take a long time to unfold. So from that initial vote in 1922 to her ordination in 1972, right? It's a neat 50 years. And a lot of institutional and societal change has to happen, but there is this kind of forward motion that gets us there. I think what's so scary about what's happening right now at the Supreme Court is that it's backwards motion, right? So we had this forward motion that got us, let's say, from my great grandmother hanging out, translating Margaret Sanger's speeches into Yiddish on the back of a pushcart on the Lower East Side in the 1920s, to 1972 when it becomes legal, or 1973. And now in 2022, we're rolling back history and we're rolling back rights. And that just feels so antithetical to who we are as Americans, right? Like, we have a history of continuing to provide more rights and more rights. I mean, if you look at, the Constitution, if you look at the Bill of Rights, like, it doesn't actually include everybody, right? We know that. I mean, women, Black people, like, it wasn't a perfect document. And, what we've continued to do is improve on it and provide more rights and more, safety for people, more ability to be full citizens and participate in democracy. And what's happening right now on so many levels is a rolling back of all of that. And that is terrifying. It's not the way history is supposed to work.
This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. A link to the transcript of this episode is available in the podcast notes, along with links to any news stories or reports referenced for this episode.